It's good to see you. So what's been going on?
Good to see you too. Not much, but a few things. So I guess I'll reintroduce myself maybe for the podcast, since I've evolved a bit, I think, since I've been over at the team there. So right now, my role as I'm working for a company called True Digital Group, which is basically the digital arm of a large telco in Thailand. You can kind of think of it similar to Verizon. But I think we have kind of the ambitious goal to really help spearhead a lot of the digital transformation that's happening in Thailand and kind of, further on throughout the Southeast Asian region as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a few main pillars of the company. We're doing that through, we have like a digital academy where we're trying to upskill people's digital knowledge, everything from marketing to big data, statistics, data science, that kind of thing. We also have a division that works on kind of interesting, cool projects like IoT types of things, robots, vending machines, all kinds of stuff. But then the last part of the company, which is kind of where I'm more focused, is a platform that we call True ID. Basically, it's you can think of it as a super app. We like to kind of internally joke it's more like a mega app. Basically, on the surface, it's really a platform that allows you to stream live TV, video on demand content. There's article content, but there's a lot more than that as well. I mean, we do. There's communication types of features inside, like video calling, chatting. We have a large privilege kind of program. So we have like a digital wallet. You can use that at a variety of merchants. Yeah, get points, redeem those for privileges. We have a commerce side. Yeah, it's quite large, to say the least. And that is, I think, the trend of a lot of the apps, at least on this side of the world right now. You have apps like Gojek and things like that are kind of like these in WeChat, obviously, that are just these huge apps. So we're kind of doing the similar type of thing out here. And to make it even more complicated, I guess, this platform, I called it an app, but it's actually on multiple platforms. So we have it on the web, we have app, Android and iOS. And we also have like an OTT platform too, so like a set-top box. And to top it off, we're building a progressive web app to expand internationally outside of Thailand a little bit. So that's like a little bit of background on the company. My role, so I'm basically heading the product analytics team, is what they call it. So I'm basically on the product side of True ID. And really finally giving governance to how all the analytics is being implemented across these platforms, and also to help drive like a kind of a data-driven culture there. So everything from like helping with the frameworks that the product team uses to optimize the products, and a lot of that. A lot of my work so far has been really involved with replatforming the analytics. As a company, we're very heavily reliant on Google Cloud. So because of that, on the app side, we're implemented Firebase. Basically, we have GA360, GBQ, the whole cloud platform, basically. In terms of, while I have been very neck deep in the process of this, I think this is what kind of triggered that tweet where sometimes there's a lot of very crazy challenges and we're struggling to find out what to do, and then I suddenly realized that there's not as much content relating to app analytics out there, and it's fundamentally very different than web analytics in many ways. I mean, there's obviously some similarities, and the way things are going, we're kind of bridging these two worlds a lot more. But I just found that kind of interesting. So, that was kind of the synopsis of the background of this conversation.
And for me, in the meantime, while you're tweeting about that, I have 2, now 3 different clients that are all trying to figure out what their whole ecosystem is going to look like for their mobile analytics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm having a devil of a time. I'm getting a handle on it enough to help them out and or give good recommendations and tell them, oh yes, this tool will help you with this specific thing. And I think that's part of it. It's just there are so many different tools. There is no Adobe suite of optimization, acquisition, like all of this stuff in one thing. Now, technically, the Adobe suite is the Adobe suite for mobile, I suppose. You can use it for mobile. But I don't have many folks that are choosing to do that just because it's not something they specialize in.
Yeah, I think fundamentally a lot of the tracking is very different. Even when you're designing what the implementation should look like on app versus web. I mean, at the various highest level, you have a lot more interactions on app than you do with the web. The way people use apps, it's a lot more clicking, scrolling, going back and forth between screens. But then even at a higher level, it's the app is in the foreground versus the background, depending on the type of app. So what is defined as a session? I mean, there's obviously technical definitions for these things, but there are some fundamental nuances between platforms that you have to take into account as well. Yeah. And
so
I think sorry.
So one of the things that came up is just how siloed the analytics stuff for mobile can be from the more traditional web analytics side of things. And so you say you're over product analytics. How much do you talk to the marketing analytics or web analytics or whatever we want to call the older the team we're used to working with?
Yeah, so I would say the way we kind of structure it, or the way we're moving to, is that the product analytics, I guess, I'm kind of the hub of all the other analytics teams, because the way we think of it is that basically I influence what data gets leveraged by the other teams. So I think of all the other internal teams that use the data, such as the marketing team. We have another. We have a variety of analytics platforms teams. Some other teams, we have there's a team building like personalization models on behavioral data. We have a security team that's using the data to develop fraud models and that kind of thing. So all of their requirements basically funnel through me. Being on as a member of the product or any product organization, usually you have an intake of requirements from your customers. So in our case, it's just the customers are other internal teams. That's how we think of it. Yeah.
So how much are you trying to standardize then between all of the different things? For instance, a lot of folks would try to, maybe if they're not using the same data layer, tag management or whatever on mobile, because it's, different, but all the same, like, okay, if we're capturing this on the checkout flow on the web, we're going to also make sure we capture this in the checkout flow in the app, and capture it as similarly as possible.
Yeah, so we're trying to, my goal is to really make everything as identical as possible.
Okay.
If you're familiar with the way Google's been moving their suite, so they have this app plus web property, which is basically the idea of, it's based on the Firebase data model, which is coming from the app side, and they're trying to recreate it on the website, basically. So that, we're basically following that general philosophy. In the past, things were definitely not like that, and to be honest, at the moment, they're not completely like that yet. It becomes a problem because someone from the business might be interested in some KPI it doesn't depend on the platform. When you have the same tool, cross-platform app and web, someone may, and ask a question. It's not like how many videos were watched on app or how many videos were watched on web. They just want to know how many videos were totally watched.
Right.
So there's a lot of aggregation that needs to happen. In the past, that aggregation was very manual through queries, but very complicated queries because we were matching different data models together. Right. I think the first thing is really trying to get the events aligned as much as possible. And even once the event names and the parameters that you have passed are all the same, there's still a lot of different nuances you have to keep in mind, obviously, because the way these events get triggered could be different between platforms. So yeah, it is quite challenging. And there hasn't been one easy way to do it that I've been aware of, at least. It's been a lot of trying to. I think one thing that's really helped is really trying to standardize documentation that different development teams can interact with, because that's the one extra complicated thing, is that I am working with so many different development teams simultaneously, and it's like, if we help to share that common set of resources, like on a wiki or something like that, then it does help a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine. So is that kind of what you're saying, where you're having a hard time finding documentation and things like that, that it feels kind of Wild West-ish, like
in terms of best practices, I think, and some of the things that I struggle with and we're experimenting with, and talking to other vendors, and I mean, we're getting a sense of best practices. There's been a lot of trial and error, but examples of things that I actually had, like actual examples I had questions about before. So like if you're scrolling through products, like and you want to fire like impressions, like what's the best practice around when those should fire? Sure. Like, is it in the screen after a certain X number of milliseconds? Is it there's many ways you can do things, and it's always like a balance. So it's just that lack of not knowing what the best practice is, if there is a standard or not, that I think was kind of lacking.
Well, I think some of that is it just evolves so quickly. I think of how long it took me before I felt comfortable, say, blogging about what I felt like was a best practice in web analytics. That I'd have to have implemented it a few times, seen the gotchas and what works well and what doesn't work well, and then I'd feel comfortable talking about it and telling people what I had figured out. With mobile, by the time I've gotten to that point, it's changed.
Yep.
It's really hard to play catch up kind of with, well, I had it all figured out, and I did. I felt like I was on top of mobile 2 or 3 years ago, because it was all that I was doing for one particular client. And then I get out of that space for a year or so and then come back into it, and I don't really know. I'm learning as quickly as I know the Adobe side pretty darn well, but everything else, and like I said, Adobe doesn't actually do all of the different pieces. So at bare minimum, you've got Adobe and a branch integration, or so many other. There's got to be something more to get the acquisition information and the push notifications and all of that. So.
Yeah, that's a
web and app hasn't even been out there that long for Google Analytics. So
and that's a great point. And the other thing that's we're always playing catch up to are the changes in the actual mobile platforms as well. Like the Android and iOS side are constantly making changes to in every OS update on what they're allowing privacy wise. Whether we can get like device identification information, the ID occasionally changes. A lot of things like, I mean, the other complicated thing too on the commerce side is when you're doing anything with payments or subscriptions, then sometimes you have the in-app purchases, with the Apple tax and things like that you have to take into account. So it gets. There's a lot to keep up on, and all of those things seem to change independently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, you've been very quiet. Hi, Jim.
Hey, Jim.
Yeah, no, it's no worries. Like, I think sometimes the best episodes are the ones where I don't actually speak. So. No, it's fascinating to hear, because you're right. Like, one of the things with mobile, it just seems to evolve so fast, and everybody's off doing their own thing. So trying to standardize to your point, for multiple reasons, development reasons and whatnot. Yeah, that always seems to be the struggle. So I think we actually just kind of dove into the conversation. So just to give our listeners and actually now our viewers a bit of context. A couple weeks ago, this whole thing started with a tweet you had put out saying how that you were seeing like a huge divide between analytics documentation for web, which is something we're all used to at this point, and then app. So Jen had replied about what she sees as the cause, and she actually brought the tweet to my attention. And I'm like, this would be a great episode to bring you on for. So yeah, it was great to hear the context on behind what that was. But Jen, I kind of want to dig into to your response a bit. Like what you were saying is one of the reasons that you see the divide behind behind that is there's actually two different groups owning analytics depending upon if it's web or app. So can you speak to that a bit more?
Sure. So, and I actually currently have a client that, for the sake of the web analytics folks, the marketers, and the web experience designers, and all of that, they have implemented Adobe Analytics on their app. But then, for the sake of the developers and it's a separate set of developers, they have outsourced the development of their app. For the sake of that team and the folks that are over them, they've implemented Firebase. And then when they realized that Firebase couldn't get them everything they wanted, they also implemented Google Analytics. So all three of those now are on one app, and they're all kind of going to different teams. And I feel like I've seen that quite a bit, where if we do end up getting web analytics technology, I shouldn't call it web analytics, Adobe Analytics, implemented on an app, the developers will do it just because they're told to, and there's a JIRA ticket they want to check off, but that's not the data that's going to matter to them. They're going to implement their own thing separately, and they'll be using that. Is that something you guys have seen, or I don't know, maybe it's just my specific clients? But.
Yeah, I think to that, I don't know if this is the part of what you were referring to, but I think the type of data that sure, some of the events should be lined up exactly, but some of the other behavioral elements might be very different between app and web, because I think the way you optimize each of these platforms, if you're talking about using analytics for UX optimization or something, can be very different between app and web. And flows can vary differently. So I guess there are some things that should line up exactly, and then there's other things that I think it's okay to diverge a bit on what is being tracked. It's very important that
as far as the people that are interested, that there are some folks that are more interested in analytics in like the old school Adobe Analytics or even Google Analytics sense, and then a different set of folks that are probably more mobile minded that are much more interested in Firebase or Localytics or any of the other like more mobile specific tools.
Now, are you talking about this from the reporting standpoint, like the reporting UI of Firebase? Yeah, so that's definitely a challenge, actually. Like many places, I think we were all heavily on Google Analytics across the board on app and web. We're still using it on the web. So moving to Firebase, it is very different. Now, I don't recommend, and I don't think Google recommends using the old Firebase console anymore for analytics. It's very, very limited. Now they have this app plus web property, which is they are actively developing, and every release it's getting closer and closer to the GA interface. In some ways it's better. In some ways it's more limited still.
Right.
And
that also brings us back to it's evolving so quickly, it's impossible to be an expert in it yet.
And this is a big problem, because when you're with Firebase, and I have become quite a advocate for Firebase overall. But from the reporting side, it can be a challenge because this app plus web property is great, but whereas on the web, I think Google recommends kind of keeping app plus web as a secondary property because it's still in beta. But on mobile, it's the only tool. There's no backup. It's the primary. And if the primary is in beta, there can be problems. There's currently no enterprise version of app plus web available. That will change in due time. But at the moment, it is challenging. And we do hit a lot of those challenges a lot. So because of that, we end up having to, make, we have to build like an entire data pipeline from the data into BigQuery, where we build analytics data marts. And then we have, we allow, someone to create like a data studio dashboard off of those data marts, or, query directly. But that is a realistic consideration at the moment. I think you have to be a lot more data savvy to get insight from the app data, or rely on, the analysis or dashboard from someone that is, I think. Whereas I think a lot of the web tools have matured a lot more because it's been around for a little bit longer and a little bit easier to judge. I think you can get some good insights out of the box from any app analytics platform, but realistically, I found, I'm sure you find as well, in day-to-day, and especially organizations that become more mature, you're asking questions a lot deeper than those pretty reports that are surfaced. So
and
it
when
does
you're
involve a lot
used
of
to
digging in.
one of the web analytics tools, and I'm just going to call them that because just to differentiate. But and one of the things we ran up against was trying to apply segments to different parts of our Firebase data, and finally just like, we'll just use Adobe for that. Because at this point, and this was months ago too, so it's changing fast. There's still some limitations.
The other thing is like
there's definitely things that it does far better than the web analytics tools do.
Absolutely. Things like cohort analysis and there's some interesting things. I mean, there are, I think, just some fundamental deeper challenges with doing app analytics overall. It's a lot more deeply integrated is another problem. Whereas on the website, you can really rely on, a data layer and GTM to really modify the implementation in a scalable way. I mean, obviously that's what we all preach, but on the app, that really doesn't exist.
Right.
It's a lot more deep integration with development. So I guess one tip I would give for all those about to embark on this journey is to try to come up with some sort of library or framework for, triggering events. You have to, so for instance, if something is deployed and then you want to pass another parameter with that event, a lot of times it will require going back into the app, doing another release cycle. And even that is very different than the web as well, because you have to wait for the app release, the app store approval, and this whole process.
The Apple Store.
Yep. And then the other fun thing, which I don't know if you don't realize, like I didn't realize until I was very deep in app analytics, is if there's a bug and you fix it, that old version with the bug will still be around, for a while, because not everyone updates their app the second it's released. So that's another kind of thing to consider versus the web. Whereas if there's a tracking bug, everything's fixed immediately.
Or even
so
not even necessarily a bug, but a new feature that you're tracking.
Yeah, a new feature.
Like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
One quick question on that, because I mean, I've heard many people talk about that. Like for your specific case, like what percentage of people do you see still using an older version of the app, where you have something like that, where you've deployed either some kind of new tracking or you've deployed a bug fix that you still have to account for?
It's surprising. I would say, I couldn't tell you the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I would say well, maybe to use the 80-20 rule, I think 80% of people will probably update within the first day or 2 days. I think they have the automatic updates enabled, but you still see older versions of the app, and sometimes multiple versions old for weeks. So there's definitely kind of a longer tail of those people that last, and sometimes you just wonder, like, why don't you update? Like, why? What do you love the the old version? I don't understand why it takes so long. But it can be a lot longer than you would expect. So I mean, on that front, I will say, if we were getting technical, so GTM is available on apps. It doesn't work exactly the same way as the web, but actually, if you use Firebase, or you can actually use it to, in some cases, for like if there's a typo in your event or something, you can use it to actually manipulate the event, which does get deployed across the board all at once. So I mean, there's in some cases. Yeah.
A few years ago, we were really scared because the Apple Store was starting to come down on things like a tag management system that would allow you to make changes without going through their painful process. But fortunately, they haven't made it possible yet.
Yeah, actually, on that front, the other type of thing that comes into to light is A/B testing, optimization tools as well. Testing on the app, and being able to test outside of releases and things like that. It definitely can be a little bit trickier.
Yeah, that Apple Store. I say as a person with my iPhone that But well, it's funny. So a few years back, I made an app, my silly little pocket. I always call it my silly app because it is. It's a Pocket SDR. It uses the Adobe Analytics or admin API to pull down all of your report settings and stuff, so that if you're looking at your data and you're like, oh, I forgot what event 5 is, you can look at it on your phone. But I partially did it because it's a tool that I needed, but partially just because I wanted an excuse to get into mobile development some and mess around with it myself and learn. Now, to be fair, it wasn't true mobile development because I used Ionic, which is basically an Angular framework for the phone, so I could still do it all in JavaScript and HTML, and then it would turn it into native code for me. But I still had to go through the App Store processes. And like I'm very glad I did it. I learned a whole bunch. Unfortunately, since it was 2 years ago, a bunch has changed since then too. But I think that's part of the problem is there isn't a great way to mess around, and it's hard to get a sandbox for mobile and learning and best practices and stuff. Whereas HTML, JavaScript, I can just throw that up on localhost. I don't even need to host it anywhere, and I can mess around with it.
Yeah, it's absolutely true, and especially when you get to the Android ecosystem, where there's many different models of phones, many different screen resolutions, and it's very, very difficult to. There's always going to be bugs in something. Yep.
Yeah. So it's hard to get yourself exposure to it, and then it's hard to audit and see what's happening in real time. Now the tools are getting better and better at this. That Adobe has Griffin, and then I know we're working with a client that's on Amplitude and Imparticle, and that has some like real time. You can see what your particular device, what data is being sent. I should know, but I don't know off the top of my head if Firebase and or Google has something similar to but that makes it really, really hard because I'm very used to show me the beacon that happened on this precise user action in real time.
Well, I mean, I can answer the question. Like on the Firebase side, there is a debug view basically.
Okay.
So you can set up your device to debugging and see events stream in real time. There's another way that I actually like to debug on the Android side. There's a way to enable basically like terminal logging in Android Studio.
Yeah, I've used that a few times.
Yeah, so that.
I hate Android Studio, but yeah,
I use it specifically for that. I don't do any development, but
yeah. Well, in theory, you can do the same with Xcode for an iPhone too.
But yeah, it is a little bit more difficult to debug for sure on the app side. We'll say. Also, it's sometimes harder to recreate a journey depending on how complicated your app is versus web,
or how specific their device was.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other scenarios too on the app. I mean, another thing that comes into play when you're heavily marketing an app is the notion of deep linking into the
Yes.
app. So there's a lot of things that can go around that, and of course attribution. And that's the other factor that you have to keep in mind when if following the changes of the Android and iOS ecosystems wasn't enough, then all the big advertising platforms like Facebook and such are constantly changing their what data they're allowing and not allowing and blocking. And there's a lot of content that can be written. So that's why I was very surprised there was none.
Well, get on it, John.
Yeah.
Well,
if there's demand.
Yeah. One of the things that we're up against too is just all of the different data sources that even if you have like a super strong Firebase, you've got everything you want there, you still have to figure out how to get and which data from the app stores that you want. And okay, so we can track people deep linking directly into the app and some of the acquisition of how did folks open the app and all of that. But if they don't have the app yet and they go to the app store, it's hard to connect okay, what is it that drove them to the app store? And that drove them to download. We can see that easily enough in the app store. But then how did they convert afterwards based on the original, what drove them to the app store? And there are different tools that can help you do that. But they're all, yet again, third-party integrations and things like that. And that single thing has been one of the hardest things for most of my current clients that are looking at this stuff to get around of. We're not used to having multiple data sets for such things and tying it together because, Adobe and Google do that so nicely for web.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
no, getting
that's
that whole user
true.
experience is tricky.
Yep, and it's another thing that, we do have another attribution platform. In our case, we're using a tool called AppsFlyer, which you may have heard of. I think they've been a great partner to work with.
I want to say that's one that Adobe more out of the box recommends now, or like if you go into launch and the launch documentation, it's the one that they say.
Yeah, no, it's a great tool, but it's it is another thing that requires implementation as well. And so there's I think there's a lot more governance too when it comes to using data that's app data too, because in this case there's going to be attribution data in the attribution tool, but there will also be some things by default in some of the other app tools. The way we've approached it at our company is basically just making a line in the sand and saying, if you're doing anything with attribution, use the attribution tool. Just ignore what's in the others. But that does require, some more things to keep in mind. Things are not as clean and refined as they are on the website at the moment. That's for sure.
Yeah. So in conclusion, mobile apps are confusing and complicated.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of other things. I could go on and on about all the challenges. Another interesting thing too, you mentioned real-time events too. In some cases events don't come in real time too, because like your phone could be offline. There's some things where actually on the Firebase side, they throttle events based on to help save battery and bandwidth in certain cases, and that's actually that's another consideration when you are doing an analytics implementation on mobile. No matter what the tool is, if you're triggering a lot of events or having a lot of logic, it might have some impact on battery life or performance as well. Something you really don't have to consider usually on the website. So there are ways around all of these things, but in my experience so far, it's been there has to be a lot more technical considerations, I think. Yeah, but there are some actual more fun things too, like you mentioned notifications. It's a whole other medium that you can play with for acquisition on mobile that doesn't really exist so much on the web. SMS, that kind of thing. And you have location data too. This can be very cool.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier. I was just curious about. You mentioned A/B testing on the app. Have you had a chance to do any of that, and how's that turned out for you?
Yeah, we do some tests at the moment. We're using so we have kind of a more simple framework. We use the A/B testing capability within Firebase. They have a module called Remote Config that basically works like I mean, it's basically like you can think of it like a config file in the cloud if you're not familiar with it. So you can toggle something on or off, but that requires, the variations to be basically coded within the app.
It's not like there's like an empty div that you can toggle
not
send
so
this
much
content into it from a remote. Yeah.
Although we have been actually looking into some other A/B testing platforms, more mature ones, or more. I should not say more mature, more specialized. Yeah. And once again, another tool, but there are some great ones on the market. Things like Optimize, for instance, that it doesn't work. It's a balance. It's not completely like that empty div in the old, or in the web world. But there are some things that you can actually manipulate through a UI without actually making code changes in the app. It is limited to some degree, but you can do stylistic and textual changes kind of without coding changes. But any kind of deeper, user journey testing probably will require some extra development effort. But I think that said, there are ways that you can architecture the app, when you get to like the more enterprise scale, to make it more ready for doing testing. So whereas it might be very cumbersome at the beginning, because maybe you probably developed your app without testing in mind. So to test something, you might have to refactor many different elements. But over time, I think we've found that we can evolve the architecture of the app to facilitate testing more. So and part of that, I think, is getting the development teams more involved in the process, what we're trying to do with the app, what we're trying to test, to have these things in mind when when there's a million ways to code something, to make it more, to make it in a way that's easier to test, or to create toggles on things that maybe don't have tests at the moment but might in the future. So a lot of those things can help ease it in the longer term. But I think again, you just have to keep it in mind at the onset more.
So using that as an example, let's say I've got decent analytics on my app, and now I'm wondering how to get a optimization tool, or more personalization, or better acquisition, or I want to up my push notification game. This is where I start to struggle, because there are so many different vendors out there, and it's no longer a given of, I'm using Adobe Analytics, I'll use Adobe Target. So trying to sort out which is the best and which fits my needs best. But then B, all of the things that you were just talking about of, hey, you can actually architect your app in a way that works better for optimization if you know what you're doing and all of that. Is that documented somewhere? Like, where do I go for a guide on doing that?
That's a great question.
Get on it, John.
I think that is the kind of the knowledge that's lacking. I mean, for my use case, it's been we've been going through a lot of trial and error. Initially, I think some of the team was, I don't want to say frustrated, but I think, maybe frustrated that we were moving slower, or that things, maybe we reverted something. But I tried to do I tried to communicate out that I think this is the way that it is industry wide at the moment. I mean, I don't think there's anyone that's really a complete expert at all at all of this stuff. So I mean, I think at the moment it is some trial and error. In an odd way, maybe this is me being an optimist. It's fun a little bit, actually. It almost reminds me of when web analytics was first starting and there weren't really best practices and you were trying to develop them. But then at the same time, every time you iterate, there's a longer leeway because of all the things we talked about before. But I think some of those things are not well documented industry wide, and that said, I think it's probably also more challenging to document some of this stuff, because I think every app, especially an app, by definition, apps are very uniquely made for whatever function they're built for. so there's not always like a common framework that even apps are built around. So I think that comes the challenge of it. But I mean, I think that said, there probably are some general guidelines that probably can be communicated out that can help these things. But yeah, overall, I think it's just more of a kind of you need to take a more holistic, collaborative approach with app analytics versus web analytics. It's been my kind of experience so far. I mean, and what I mean by that is really involving, every team to be up to date on what's going on, what the roadmap will enable in the future. But yeah, but it's challenging
because as a consultant, it's very hard to come in with hey, we're going to iterate and figure this out together.
No,
and I've got a lot of resources and experience, but this is also changing a lot, and yeah, there's going to be some figuring it out together. Unfortunately, most of my clients they get that. The ones that are working on mobile things, but it's hard for me.
That side, yeah.
And I can't just say, you know what, give me a week, I'll figure it out on my own. Because, like I said, it's really hard to sandbox and test, and all the reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I feel your pain there, but well, if you ever want to collaborate on problems, I'm happy to talk about them.
I might
take you up on that. We can start our own community. We can start our own community.
And I actually have had a few conversations. Like there's one that was a former client that he and I were working on app stuff all the time, nonstop, a few years ago. And I reached out recently, like, are you still really deep in the app world? Can I pick your brain? And he's not, unfortunately. And then Jim Gordon and Nancy Coons and I were like, hey, it seems like there's a lack of information about mobile stuff out there on Twitter. And so we ended up having a chat, but I don't know that any of us three could claim to be experts. It was more us talking about the lack of expertise, I think.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to even find the folks who would be current that I can talk to. So John, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. We can start this. And I also wonder, I don't know if this is a common thing, or I know it was true at my company that in the past, app analytics was completely run by the technical teams.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So that might be a common thing as well, whereas, I think technical, they can implement it, trigger the events fine, but not always in a way that is conducive to analysis or how the business wants to see things. And that might be part of the reason for the state of the industry.
Well, and for a while it was easier because when orgs were making apps, they didn't know yet what they were doing, and they were just making their apps to be exactly like their websites. Which probably not the best user experience, but it sure did simplify things for the analytics.
Yeah, but it's quickly becoming a very app-first world. Yeah.
Yep.
Definitely. At least I can speak for in now I'm kind of out of the loop in Western tech, but in Asia at least, there's a lot of companies that don't even have websites now. A lot of actually one example in the industry here, like banking, for instance, a lot of banks in Southeast Asia, you can't even do banking on the web. Like you need to use an app. Yeah, so everything, app first is really app first. Like sometimes the website is really just a branding kind of website, but all the functionality really is on the app side. And I think the reason for that is that, at least in this region, Southeast Asia, a lot of people don't have personal computers at home. Now they maybe have a computer at the office if they work in an office, but everyone has a phone. So it really makes sense that that's really the medium that all these things get distributed. So yeah, there could be some geographical differences on that too, but I think globally, yeah.
With with the work you've been doing with the app, has there been like that one thing you've come across and you're just like, that is so effing cool? It is so much cooler than something similar I could have done on the website of things.
I think, boy, that's a difficult question. There's a lot of it. I think one thing that's really interesting with apps overall is that you can really incorporate location into things. And I mean things like I mean, you can really do like personalized marketing based on location. You can cater an experience based on location, and a location that's constantly changing.
Mhm.
Whereas on you're usually not carrying your desktop around, I don't think, but
Sure.
yeah. So there's a lot of things like that in mind. I think you can there's a lot more flexibility in terms of user experience. I mean, like interactions, the UX basically, that you can do on on apps as well. So I mean, I think each platform has its definite use cases, of course, but I'm finding it interesting. I mean, it seems like apps can be completely flexible, obviously, to whatever you want them to do. And I mean, that goes really deep in terms of the way you interact with it as well. So, I mean, I think you can come up with all kinds of interesting interactions, gestures and things like that. But then, I mean, I guess going back to our conversation, and then you always wonder, like, how do you track these things?
Right.
So.
Yeah. They shook their phone to erase something, or
Yeah. Like, do you want that to trigger an event too? Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of, like, anything can trigger an event, really, in the app. So it's there is a lot more. It's like playing 3D chess, I feel like, in terms of doing the implementation. Sometimes there's a lot more things to consider. Yeah. Not that I know how to play 3D chess, but it seems very complicated.
So one of the things I'm thinking we come out of this conversation, because we're talking about, it sounds like there's a lot of need, a lot of desire for information around this, but there isn't anything yet, and everyone's kind of looking to see, like, how can we get this started? I'm thinking maybe what we could do is we could start to have like a regular app-based episode. We'll bring other people on. John, we'll get you back. Jen. Maybe we reach out to Jim Gordon, Nancy Coons, and others who are all doing this, and maybe we start like a regular panel to start the conversation on where do we go, but what are people seeing, to see what that can generate. I think that could be something good coming out of this.
Yeah, I'd definitely be involved. Interested.
If nothing else, I would just love to hear, hey, what is your suite of tools from all of these people? Because I mean, even you, John, you've mentioned probably 6 different things of, we have AppFlyer for this and we're using this for that, and that's been the hardest thing for me to wrap my mind around in a lot of cases of what combination of tools is going to get me everything I need, and what are even the options that'll get me there. So I would love to pick people's brains about that.
Yeah. So let's do it. I'll get the thread started. Let's start seeing who else wants to be involved.
And if there are listeners out there who feel like they are mobile experts, please ping me. I'll bake you cookies.
Yep. Come have a chat with us. So as we're wrapping up, I think I'd be remiss, John, to just see, like, how are things just going over in Thailand right now? Just personal life. How are things been? It's been a while since we chatted. How's life?
Yeah, things are going really well, and I have to admit that I'm a little personally guilty to say. I feel guilty to say that because I follow the
Survivor's
news.
guilt of 2020.
But yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah, things are going quite well out here. It was. I mean, work-wise, it was a bit of a transition from 33 Sticks to kind of corporate life again. But in an odd sense, it was easy to adapt to the working from home kind of policies that we had out here. In terms of that situation, we've been very fortunate out in Asia. I think there were some strict measures early on. And a lot of compliance. The country's been closed off, so luckily, I mean, that was. I think we fared a lot better than anyone kind of expected on that side of things. So hopefully that will last. But yeah,
So
I mean, I think.
Had you been working in the office before quarantine stuff?
I was, yes. Yeah, okay. I was.
So you went remote at 33.6, and then you were on site for a while, and then had to go remote again.
And it was great timing because, I mean, I love the office. We have nice facilities, but I definitely miss some of the working from home as well, and the productivity that that.
And by working from home, you mean working from gorgeous coffee shops? And...
Yeah, now I've actually been
well,
working
now,
from home.
all right, fair enough.
But yeah, no, but it's been good, and obviously it's been a different kind of challenge, especially based on what we've been talking about too, the app side. So I've been trying to learn a lot more and try to absorb as much as possible. But yeah, just good. I feel. I think one of the reasons, that I said I initially was leaving 33 Sticks, which was still to this day a very hard decision. But I think partly outside of the job thing, I just wanted to feel more kind of integrated into the time zone and the culture out here. So yeah. I think on that front, it's been really good. I definitely feel a lot more part of the like more of a normal resident out here now.
Not a vampire.
Yeah, waking up in the morning and such. So that's been good. But yeah, no, thanks. I hope things are going well with you guys too. This is the first time we've all talked in probably like a year.
Sure. Yeah, and definitely been interested in get you back on the podcast just to reconnect. So glad to hear everything is going well out there.
Thanks. Yeah, I was happy to use to bust out my microphone that I haven't touched in so long.
Nice. Well, John, it was great catching up. Jen, thanks for joining us again. So we'll wrap up for now. But yeah, I think one of the things coming out of this, I want to see if I can't get like a regular app series like panel going, because it seems like that's a lot. People are looking for a lot of that. So
that'd be great.
Yep. Cool. Well, thank you both, and we'll catch everybody later.